I'm Susan Yockey with VOA's Middle East Monitor. Coming up, the Pakistani Prime Minister faces the Supreme Court. How does a prominent Egyptian politician feel about the political picture in his nation? UN concern about the situation for Palestinians.
If Gaza is going to come off its dependence on humanitarian aid, we need to see economic development and economic activity in Gaza.
And our reporter chats with a man she believes is Islamophobic. It's all ahead on the Voice of America. Pakistan's Prime Minister Yusuf Raza Gilani has appeared before the country's Supreme Court to face contempt charges. He arrived at the court today under a heavy security presence to defend his decision not to ask Swiss authorities to reopen a corruption case against President Asif Ali Zardari. Mr. Gilani says President Zardari, as head of state, has immunity. The court adjourned the case until February, giving Mr. Gilani 2 weeks to prepare his argument. He faces a potential jail sentence and removal from office if he is found guilty. Mr. Gilani's lawyer, Adza Hassan, said he would make the immunity argument when the hearing resumes on February 1st. He spoke as lawyers supporting Pakistan's opposition shouted in protest.
I think the issue was different, but now, when the court compels me to discuss Article 248, I will bow to the court order and will also speak on immunity to satisfy the court that the president has complete immunity.
Ahmed Rashid is a journalist and writer based in Lahore. He tells VOA's Sarah Williams why Mr. Gilani believes Mr. Zardari has immunity.
Well, the Constitution does give the president immunity against all sorts of things, but there are differing interpretations of immunity. For example, the opposition lawyers say that if the president was found guilty of murder, for example, he would be had up. And others say, no, he has total immunity while he's president over everything.
What is known about the scope of these corruption charges against Mr. Zardari?
Well, they're very long-standing. They were made in the 1990s when Benazir Bhutto's government, that is his wife's government, who was later assassinated, when Benazir Bhutto's government was dismissed twice in the 1990s. It was elected twice and dismissed twice, and corruption charges were raised then. And Asif Zardari spent a total of 11 years in jail during the 90s and after 2001, facing corruption charges both in Switzerland as well as in Pakistan. And he was not found guilty of any of these charges. And in fact, the case in Switzerland shut down and said that, it cannot be reopened. He is, no longer wanted here as a possible culprit for corruption, etc. And now the Supreme Court is asking for that case to be reopened. But the government feels it's not obliged to reopen it. Secondly, the Swiss have said that they will not reopen the case. It's a closed issue now. And the Prime Minister has always maintained that there was no need to reopen it because the President had immunity even if he was found guilty of anything. Now he seems to have softened that stance, and just before he appeared in court, his lawyer said to journalists that there would be no harm if the Prime Minister was to write this letter to open the court cases, but the Prime Minister and I and everyone else know that the President has immunity.
Is this case partly caused because of the continuing pressures between the civilian government and the military?
Yes, it is very much. What most people now accept is that the military and the courts have lined up against the government and really want to see both the Prime Minister and the President resign and put so much pressure on them that they do resign. So this is very much a kind of political battle where, if you like, the legalities of the whole issue are secondary to the political needs of both sides. The People's Party leaders obviously wanting to stay in government, in power, and the army and the judiciary wanting them out.
Journalist Ahmed Rashid speaking from Lahore about the appearance of Pakistani Prime Minister Yusuf Raza Gilani before the country's Supreme Court.
Are you looking for a comprehensive daily look at events reshaping the Middle East? Visit voanews.com/ME. You'll find VOA's original reporting from the region, in-depth analysis from our Washington team, VIP interviews, online polls, photo essays, and many documentaries. Bookmark us or add us to your RSS reader. That's voanews.com/ME.
10 days before the first anniversary of the Egyptian Revolution, prominent Egyptian reform campaigner and Nobel Prize winner Mohammed el-Baradei pulled out of the race to become Egyptian president. VOA senior Middle East correspondent Mohammed el-Shanawi spoke with Ayman Noor, another potential presidential candidate, about the impact of el-Baradei's pulling out of the presidential elections in April of this year. And he now joins me here in the studio. Welcome, Mohammed.
Thank you.
Say, what was Ayman Noor's assessment of all this?
Since al-Baradei pulled out protesting that the old regime is still in place, so Ayman Noor described this development as a positive shock to the Egyptian public opinion because it revealed how superficial the post-revolution reforms are 1 year after the revolution. He also considered it a slap to the ruling Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, SCAF, and to its credibility. On the other hand, Noor described that al-Baradei's pulling out is giving Egyptian revolution a case of life in its first anniversary, so it could continue its path till it could achieve its goals of social, economic, and political reform. Baradei said he will now devote his entire energy to help the revolutionary youth complete their revolution.
Muslim Brotherhood announced that they will not support any presidential candidate who was part of the deposed regime or any candidate with a military background. How would that define who could be the next president of Egypt?
That could negatively impact chances of former Foreign Minister Amr Moussa, who was perceived as the front-runner according to most public opinion polls. It could also diminish chances for the two candidates with military background, namely Lieutenant General Ahmed Shafiq, the former Air Force officer that served under Mubarak as a Minister of Civil Aviation, as well as Lieutenant General Hussam Khairallah, the former Deputy of the Egyptian Intelligence. So if Muslim Brotherhood threw their weight behind an Islamist candidate, they will exclude Abdelmenam Abul Futuh, a former member of the Guidance Bureau of the Muslim Brotherhood, and Hazim Salah Abu Ismail, a distant follower of the Muslim Brotherhood. That would leave one Islamist as a could-be next president of Egypt, namely the Islamist thinker and lawyer Dr. Muhammad Salim Al-Awa, who is considered a moderate Islamist.
How about liberal candidate Ayman Noor, who finished as a runner-up to President Mubarak in the 2005 presidential elections?
He told me, Sue, that as a potential presidential candidate, he is facing several challenges.
من بينها وفي مقدمتها عدم اطمئنان لإدارة المجلس العسكري لهذه الانتخابات. من بينها أيضا أن لدي عقبات ما زالت.
Ayman Noor, an Egyptian president potential candidate, cited several obstacles to his campaign. First, he is not sure how would SCAF manage the upcoming presidential elections in April. Second, he may not be able to file as a candidate as a high court in Egypt upheld charges of fraud that he said Mubarak had fabricated against him following the 2005 elections. Third, SCAF recently accused Ayman Noor of instigating demonstrators to burn the scientific compound in Tahrir Square and banned him from traveling outside of Egypt. Fourth, SCAF is maintaining the same animosities that Mubarak had towards specific opposition figures, so the political environment, according to Ayman Noor, is not conducive to a real democratic transfer of power. Noor also expressed his opinion that SCAF would try to influence the presidential elections either by pressuring some candidates or by distorting the image of others, and he also said they may reach a deal with the candidate of their choice to maintain the unchecked privileges military had for decades. In return, SCAF would back this particular candidate.
Well, thank you, Mohammed.
Thank you very much.
That's VOA senior Middle East correspondent Mohammed El-Shanawi here in our Washington studios. We invite you to join in with your views at our online poll. This week we asked what should be done at the UN Security Council to make it more effective in dealing with such situations as we now find in Syria. Just visit our website at voanews.com/ME and enter your vote. That's voanews.com/ME. We want to hear from you. The United Nations humanitarian chief has told the Security Council of her concerns regarding Israeli settlement activity on Palestinian economic development and access to basic services. But the Israeli ambassador dismissed her worries, saying no humanitarian crisis exists. From the United Nations, VOA's Margaret Bashir has details.
UN humanitarian chief Valerie Amos spoke to the council in a private session. She told reporters afterwards that in the 5 years since Israel imposed a blockade on the Gaza Strip after Hamas took over, exports from the territory have been cut in half.
If Gaza is going to come off its dependence on humanitarian aid, we need to see economic development and economic activity in Gaza.
She also expressed concerns about Israeli settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, where she said they hurt economic development. And she noted with alarm the increase in violence by settlers, which she said hurts not just Palestinians, but Israelis too. The United Nations says in 2011, 5 Palestinians, including 2 children, were killed and more than 1,000 people were injured by Israeli settlers or security forces in incidents directly related to settlements, while 8 Israeli settlers were killed and 30 injured by Palestinians.
Overall, I think the whole international community accepts that settlement activity is illegal under international law, and this is certainly the position that was repeated in the Security Council today.
The United Nations also warns that Israeli restrictions on the movement of Palestinians obstruct their access to East Jerusalem and to health facilities there, which provide services unavailable at other hospitals and clinics that they can access. Palestinian envoy Riyad Mansour repeated his government's call for the immediate cessation to settlement building, saying it is a major obstacle to peace.
There is global consensus including in the Security Council, that settlements are illegal, obstacle to peace, and therefore Israel has to stop all settlement activities in the occupied territory, including East Jerusalem. And the obligation of Israel under the roadmap stipulates that they have to stop all settlement activities, including the natural growth.
Israel did briefly halt settlement building for 10 months in 2010. Ambassador Ron Prosser said the Palestinians did not take advantage of that pause and should not claim that it is the main obstacle to peace now. And he chided the Palestinians for wasting the Security Council's time bringing up the issue again. The Israeli envoy also dismissed UN concerns about the humanitarian situation, particularly in the Gaza Strip, saying while it is not rosy, people have it much worse in Haiti, Afghanistan, and Somalia. He said the real obstacles to peace are the demand that Palestinian refugees be allowed the right of return and the firing of rockets from Gaza into Israel.
Israeli children have 15 seconds to reach shelters in Israel. We need to gather them in order to find shelters. Schools are out in Israel. Million kids cannot go out to school. This is humanitarian. Do you hear a syllable about that? I'm not holding my breath to hear the first time the Security Council will say anything about rockets flying into Israel in the 67 lines of the international recognized borders. So my bottom line is there's no, and I repeat, no humanitarian crisis in Gaza.
Efforts to restart direct talks between the Israelis and Palestinians have been going on in Jordan since early this year. Last September, the Middle East Quartet, which is made up of the United Nations, the European Union, Russia, and the United States, set out a timetable for the two sides to resume direct negotiations and achieve an agreement by the end of this year. Margaret Bashir, VOA News, the United Nations.
The United States says its military forces in the Persian Gulf region are prepared to deal with any threat from Iran. Top Iranian officials have said they might close the Strait of Hormuz, a move that would disrupt world oil supplies. VOA Pentagon correspondent Luis Ramirez has prepared this report for VOA Television.
This is coalition warship.
Ready for action at sea. The U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet at Bahrain is among the massive military resources that the U.S. has permanently based throughout the region and prepared to respond if tensions with Iran escalate into direct military action. These Iranian military exercises this month are meant to show Tehran's firepower. However, analysts say that after years of international sanctions, Iran would struggle to fight a war with its aging hardware.
A lot of it was supplied at the time of the Shah. Others are relatively low-quality imports from China and Russia. It has almost no modern surface-to-air missile capabilities. Virtually all of its major combat ships date back to the time of the Shah and have had only limited refitting.
That weakness has not stopped Iran from making threats to close the Strait of Hormuz. It also warned the U.S. aircraft carrier, the USS John C. Stennis, not to return to the Persian Gulf. The United States says there is room for diplomacy, but its forces will not allow an Iranian blockade.
We cannot tolerate Iran blocking the Straits of Hormuz. And that's a red line.
The U.S. also warns Iran against developing nuclear weapons, something that could trigger an attack by Israel. Without powerful or modern equipment, Iran would resort to what analysts say are asymmetric warfare capabilities, small boats, mines, and missiles that could be used in small-scale hit-and-run attacks on U.S. forces. A full-scale offensive, they say, could cost Iran the destruction of its armed forces in a matter of days in the event of war with the U.S. or Israel.
The balance of power between the United States and Iran and between Israel and Iran is overwhelmingly in the favor of the United States and Israel.
Iran has plenty of reasons not to engage the U.S. and its allies in a full-scale confrontation, but if it does, U.S. officials say they are ready. Luis Ramirez, VOA News, at the Pentagon.
Middle East Voices has recently been taking a look at Islamophobia, the fear of Islam. With me is reporter Cecily Hillary, who has been covering the subject for our website. Cecily, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Susie.
Hey, recently you spoke with Pastor Terry Jones, the Florida-based pastor who made headlines all over the world last year for burning the Koran, against the warning of the U.S. administration, even General David Petraeus himself. A lot of people might question the wisdom of speaking to a man whose sensational act ignited so much anger around the globe. Why did you decide to talk to him?
Susie, I think that whenever a journalist covers a story, he or she needs to talk to as many sides as possible. I knew I wanted to talk to someone who clearly feared or mistrusted Muslims. And like it or not, Terry Jones is the first name that jumps to mind when you think of Islamophobia. I was also curious. I mean, he's written this very strongly titled book against Islam called Islam is of the Devil. He burned the Quran. He's incited a lot of people to jump onto the bandwagon. I really just wanted to know what makes him tick, why he feels the way he does, and what kind of person he really is.
So what does make him tick?
Well, the first question I asked was how he got to feeling about Islam the way he does. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
Well, it was somewhat of a, let's say, a long process, as you may be aware of. I lived in Europe for 30 years where I was a pastor missionary, and sort of in Europe, at the very first part of my ministry, I paid no attention to Islam other than, let's say, the religious aspect. But the longer I was there, I began to see Islam getting a greater hold upon Europe, and it began to be very disturbing. Not only is it disturbing because, obviously, I don't agree with the religion, let's say, being a pastor, being a Christian. My problem with Islam grew as I began to see the radical element of Islam, as I begin to see that there was actually much more to Islam than, let's say, it just being, in my eyes, a false religion. I saw that it is very aggressive, at least a certain percentage of the people are very aggressive, and that they desire to not integrate into a society that they have come to, thus, let's say, benefiting that society. But they desire to change it to the degree of instituting Sharia.
Now, in that 1-minute answer, you'll see he says really quite a lot, really summing up the fears of most people who don't understand Islam. They worry that Islam is a religion of violence, that Muslims, when they settle in non-Muslim countries, really aim to start imposing their beliefs and laws on the general public.
Is there any evidence to support this fear?
No, not at all, Susie. But that doesn't stop people from fearing and then spreading that fear.
Does Jones think all Muslims are dangerous?
Well, I asked him that. He says he hopes that most of the Muslims who've emigrated to the U.S. want to follow U.S. law. But honestly, Susie, he doesn't sound convinced.
I do, on the other hand, believe that there is an element of Islam that is indeed very radical and that is much larger and possibly much more dangerous than people would like to admit. One, because I believe the percentages are larger. Two, we're talking about a massive amount of people. I believe there's around 1.5, 1.6 billion Muslims in the world. So if only 10% of them are radical, you're still talking about 150, 160 million people who literally hate America, hate democracy, and want to destroy actually life as we know it.
Look, we know there have been instances of jihadist thinking in America, radical young men who've, attempted acts of terrorism like blowing up Times Square. But the vast majority, as we know, of Muslims in America are devout, hardworking, family-oriented, just loyal Americans. So I asked Jones whether he was worried or not, whether his actions and his book could harm or hurt mainstream Muslims in America. Let's listen. I guess one more question. Have you gotten to know any Muslims on a personal level? In your personal
not on a personal level, of course. My kids and myself, we had a lot of surface contact with Muslims, especially in Europe. In Germany, where I was at, there was a very large Muslim community there, actually very, very large. So many of them came to take advantages of the services that we had. So through that, we had a lot of contact with them, but it was only that type of surface contact, right?
Mm-hmm. Do you think by not getting to know them on a more personal level, you might be missing out on something?
Well, I don't really think so, because I don't have anything, like I said, in that personal sense against them.
But you certainly understand why the Muslims feel you do.
Yes, definitely. I definitely understand that. I think that's first thing we have to discuss where that blame lies. But I definitely understand that. Sure.
Uh-huh. Wow, he doesn't sound like a bad person, only a person who simply doesn't get it.
Well, that's exactly my feeling, Susie. In a way, I see Reverend Jones as a victim himself of the kind of fear-mongering we've seen really throughout America's history against a wide variety of ethnic and religious groups. And this is the kind of ignorance that just takes time and education to go away. He did say that he wishes American Muslims spoke up a little bit more to Americans. And that's a theme I've heard a lot in writing about Islamophobia, that maybe fairly or unfairly, the burden lies on the American Muslim communities to do more outreach, more explaining about their religion, and more public denunciation of those few jihadists that spoil the reputation of an entire population.
Thanks, Cecily, for stopping by.
Anytime, Susie.
And where can our listeners go to get the entire story?
They can go to our website, Middle East Voices. The web address is middleeastvoices.com.
This has been VOA's Middle East Monitor. Join us Monday through Friday for news from the region and of interest to the region. Coming up on International Edition, scientists confirm the Martian origin of Moroccan meteorites. Thanks for tuning in to the Voice of America.
For more on the stories you've heard on our radio programs, visit our website at voanews.com. That's where you'll find in-depth reports, related stories, videos, and more from our team of correspondents. Or take the news with you by downloading podcasts of your favorite VOA program. That's at voanews.com. voanews.com. Online news for a changing world.